Former VBS Chief Financial Officer, and that's Philip Truter. He has pleaded guilty to charges of racketeering, fraud, corruption and money laundering. He has since been sentenced to 10 years behind bars, 3 of which have been suspended for 5 years. Now, Truter was responsible for VBS Bank systems, financial records and annual statements. Joining us now to clarify what this means for VBS and the co-accused who are now going to have Truter singing against them. Let's speak to Stuart Theobald, and he's the chairman at Intellidex. Stuart, thank you very much for your time. Let's talk first about Philip Truter and the fact that he is no ordinary insider. He is the man who operated the systems at VBS, but chief among those was the financial records that he would have been the custodian of. How much will this help the prosecution in as far as convicting his co-accused?
Well, it's interesting. He was clearly a key cog in the overall machine, as you say, chief financial officer. He was responsible for overseeing the accounting systems of the bank. He was instructed by the chairman of the bank and other executives to make transactions, to delete balances of monies that were owing to the banks. So he had a key role in overseeing and making sure the money flowed into all of the legal destinations that it was sent to.
Yeah.
So he's well positioned to understand exactly what happened. And that's why I think Truter is a very important state's witness going forward. And this conviction and sentence is the result of a plea deal. So Truter is now working closely with the investigators in order to be able to bring together evidence to go after the rest of those involved in this just diabolical fraud.
Yeah, he becomes what is known in law as a Section 204 witness, Stuart. And that essentially means that he can answer any question from the prosecution, from those who are actually his co-accused, even to the court. Can he afford to lie?
No, I think at this point he's been sentenced. There is a plea agreement, and that depends on him being completely open and honest and conveying all of the information that he has to his knowledge. So I don't think there's anything to be gained by him in lying. He'd only be putting himself at exceptional risk from violating the conditions of his plea deal. So I expect he's going to be full and frank in disclosing all of the information that he knows.
Yeah.
Now, of course, he was really a functionary in the way that the scam worked. He was usually operating under instructions from people above him and other executives. In fact, the amount of money that Truter took out of the scam, about 5.2 million rand, was pretty small in the greater scheme of things. You have the chairman of the bank taking out around 330 million rand, so a vastly bigger scale of loot that was taken by others. But Truter's testimony is really going to be key to convicting others who were involved in this fraud.
Yeah. Before we move on from the VBS executives, because I would also like to talk about the municipal officials and the politicians involved here, but let's stick with the executives for a moment. Today, the 7 co-accused, they are appearing in court again. I think this is their second appearance. Talk to me about whether we're likely to see any of them trying to reach plea agreements with the state, now that they know that the man behind the financial records who actually had the paper trail here has turned state witness. He's going to sing against them. Can they suddenly turn and say, listen, we'd also like to reach plea agreements?
I think anything's possible, but the calculation has to be in their heads. What is the best scenario that they face here? Is it to turn state's witness and try and get a reduced sentence in return? Or is it to try and hold out in the hope that prosecutors never get around to a successful prosecution, never gather sufficient evidence, and never follow through on the prosecution? Now, there are some precedents that might give them pause. One example that comes to mind is the case of Tygon, which was another notorious scam in the early 2000s. And in that case, the chief financial officer and accountant in the group turned state's witness in the early 2000s. And as we speak today, the people he turned state's witness against remain free, having fought against any kind of court action against them for close on 20 years. So when you look at an example like that, I think the calculation for a VBS wrongdoer is, can they play a scorched earth policy, fight everything legally, try and delay cases for as long as possible, and they might well find themselves out of jail for a long time. My sense, though, in this case, is that there is real prosecutorial ambition here, that this case is high profile. It has a really important, as a bank, really important in our overall financial architecture, and there's a lot of will to ensure that prosecutions are successful here. Yeah. I would say that if you're somebody facing prosecution in this case, you're much more likely to make a deal with prosecutors than you would be generally looking at other cases and other precedents. There are other people involved who did provide evidence in the Municipal Commission. There were a couple of executives who came clean about their role, that they'd been paid money that they hadn't earned in order to facilitate this fraud. I would think that they're also providing evidence against the big fish in this case. But the prosecutors also have a choice. If they think they can succeed in a conviction without using anybody else's evidence, then there's no reason for them to do a plea deal as well. So plea deals work if you're the first one to cross the line and offer information. But if the prosecutors have what they need, they're probably not going to give you much, have much interest in doing a further deal with you to get information they already have.
So let's talk then about the fact that you have Philip Truter, who now effectively works with the state. He is going to give as much information as he can. How soon can the spotlight shine on municipal officials who were the ones who took these monies and pumped them into VBS, but also tie in there the politicians that I suspect the prosecution has to work very hard to make sure that at least some of them do go to jail?
Yeah, you're right. So there are people who are directly involved in the bank, and then there are those municipal officials who, it looks like, accepted bribes in order to direct municipal monies into the bank, to deposit it into the bank. And those officials, there have been several named, are quite senior political players, particularly in Limpopo province. We saw initially some of them were suspended by the ANC, but those suspensions have been withdrawn. We know one of them has been challenging the legality of the Mutau forensic report into VBS in the High Court, and actually had a successful judgment in August, but that's now being appealed by the Reserve Bank. So there are legal processes underway. I think it is somewhat more difficult prosecution going after the municipal officials who fraudulently moved municipal money to VBS Bank, because the legal grounds are slightly more complex. The municipalities are not permitted to make deposits into banks like VBS, into banks that are registered as mutual banks, and they've been instructed by the Reserve Bank not to do so. So they were violating regulations in that sense, but of course, additionally, they were receiving bribes to make these payments. Now, there does seem to be clear grounds for successful prosecution. The evidence that we've already seen in the Mutau report shows WhatsApp messages between people confirming the amounts, talking about Christmas boxes being paid to municipal officials. So there does seem to be a good trail of evidence. But I suspect that the prosecutors will focus on the VBS insiders, on the executives that were directly responsible for the fraud, while they build cases against the municipal officials, perhaps as a follow-up and next stage.
All right, Stuart Theobald, thank you very much for your insights. He is chairman at Intellidex. Thanks indeed for